I have the honor today of introducing our next keynote speaker, Senator Rand Paul. Senator Paul is one of the nation's leading advocates for liberty. He was elected to the United States Senate in 2010, and since he has proven to be an outspoken champion for constitutional liberties and fiscal responsibility. Senator Paul is a fierce advocate against government overreach, and he's fought tirelessly to return government to its limited constitutional scope, especially on the war powers and foreign policy issues that we're discussing here today. He's also a hardworking and dedicated physician, not a career politician. He came to Washington to shake things up and to make a difference. Dr. Paul is a devoted husband and father of three, currently living with his family in Bowling Green, Kentucky. His entrance into politics is indicative of his life's work as a surgeon, a desire to diagnose problems and provide practical solutions, which is exactly what he's done in his tenure as a United States Senator. So please join me in welcoming Senator Rand Paul.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Some people wonder, can you still believe in a policy of restraint? Can you still be someone who believes in less intervention? Can you have a realistic foreign policy in the midst of watching what's unfolding in Ukraine? Many of the folks who believe in restraint and believe in less intervention, know by heart the words of John Quincy Adams when he said, "America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy." But I think an important part of that speech, which he gave on the 45th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, an important part of that speech precedes that statement about not going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. He also said that where the standard of freedom and independence is unfurled, there will our hearts and minds be, there will our prayers, our benedictions be. So I think if John Quincy Adams were here today and he were asked about Ukraine, I think he would stand with many of us in not wanting to send troops, not in wanting to be directly involved in the war. But I think his sympathies would be with the aggrieved party, with the Ukrainians who have been attacked, with opposition to the aggression of the Russian army. So I think that is sometimes confused, because if you stand up and say, well, I don't want to get involved in this war, or if we're going to be involved in war, we have to be involved in a constitutional fashion. Congress has to vote on these things. People immediately think, and they think, oh, you're on the other side. You actually are sympathetic with the other side. And I think there are a few who have shown sympathy for the Russians, but I think the vast majority don't. I have no sympathy for Putin, for what he's done, no justification. But it doesn't mean because something terrible in the world has happened that we throw out the baby with the bathwater, that we throw out our principled beliefs so that we no longer believe in the restraints of a constitutional foreign policy. All of the principles we have still, I think, stand. But if you're asking, have the circumstances changed? Is there some sort of aspect of foreign policy that changes depending on the facts? Of course there are. Kissinger looked at this situation back in 2014, and he was asked about Ukraine. It was about the time of the Russian invasion. And his point was, he had 3 points basically. He said Ukraine ought to be free to decide what type of government they want for themselves. They ought to be free to associate economically or politically with any association, West or East, and that they should not be part of NATO. And the thing is now people are like, oh, well, you want to say that it shouldn't be part of NATO. It's a little late for that, isn't it? Putin's already invaded. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, you've already seen that there are discussions, right? In the newspaper, they're reporting that Zelensky's talking about neutrality. So it really isn't something that's a done deal. The problem with making or having this discussion is people immediately, or at least the internet trolls on Twitter, immediately think your sympathies lie. Well, it was okay that he invaded because they're not in NATO. No, it's not okay. Nobody's justifying the invasion, but we still should look for cause and effect and try to determine, is there a way out of this? It's one of the reasons I've objected to, we won't name any names, Lindsey Graham. It's one of the reasons I've objected to intemperate remarks about assassination or, chopping the head off the snake, or even President Biden saying we've got to have regime change over there. The problem with it is I think people do need to be thoughtful in what they say, because the other side hears this as well. And almost all war ends in negotiation. I mean, we see our history and we think everything is Japan. They either think everything is 1938 in Munich, or they think everything is the end of the war with Japan, and we dictated absolutely the terms. But most wars don't end that way. So if you tell your opponent, even if the opponent is the aggressor, that when the war is over, you will be drugged to The Hague and then you will be hung by the neck until you're dead, it makes them less likely to ever want to stop fighting. And it doesn't justify the aggression, but the thing is I think we do need to have an off-ramp or an exit that's available even for our enemies, even for the people we disagree with. So Kissinger talked a little bit about the three things that would happen, but he also mentioned another problem that we have had in Ukraine, and Ukraine had, and once again doesn't justify them being invaded, but is part of the problem. You have factions. You have, the eastern half more Russian-speaking, the western half more Ukrainian-speaking. You have Russian Orthodox, you got Catholics. But the problem is you have these factions, and it seems to be that when we want to have a unified federal government, they want one side's going to lord it over the other instead of one side tolerating or working with the other. And I think it's happened on both sides, whether it's been the pro-Western Ukraine or the pro-Russian Eastern, depending on who's been the ruler at the time. But part of the answer to the question of Ukraine, above and beyond, and when we get beyond and hopefully get beyond the invasion, is figuring out how to tolerate each other. And my father always put it this way. He said, liberty brings people together. So does federalism. Liberty is, you all can have different opinions as long as you don't aggress against another individual. It's the same way with federalism. The smaller the denomination of government, the smaller the division of government, the more closely it is to you, the more you feel empowered by that government, but the more you can select a government that you're more aligned with. And so the more autonomy there is to each individual region. It was the same for, Iraq as well. The more federalism you have, the better chance you have of countries getting along when they have factions that really don't seem to get along. Now, some have said, well, we wouldn't be here if we just had more sanctions, if we had just put more sanctions on Russia. I completely disagree with that sentiment. In fact, the thing is that we have lots of sanctions on Russia, and they just say, well, they make an argument that they can neither prove nor dispute. If we just had more sanctions. I'm of the opposite opinion. I think sanctions can have leverage as a threat, but once they're placed on, particularly if they're placed on without any sort of explanation of how they're going to come off or what behavior you wish to change, I think the sanctions have no effect and are probably deleterious. So I don't think any of the sanctions we put on Russia, and we have hundreds, have done anything. I don't think any of the sanctions we put on China have done anything. In fact, when representatives from the State Department come before my committee, I usually ask them, because they'll be there, they'll be the new sanctions czar, this or that, and I'll say, can you tell me one behavior that Russia has changed because of sanctions? And they'll say, well, no. I've never gotten a clear answer from one person from the State Department on one behavior that's changed. The only argument I've heard, and this is more of a public argument, is that the universal sanctions or worldwide sanctions against Iran brought them to the table. There might be some truth to that. However, there's also truth that they came to the table with a carrot as well. So there was the stick of sanctions, and sanctions are probably more effective when they're worldwide, but there also was the offer of letting them have back some of their foreign exchange money. Now, we've had some discussion already of another Iran agreement. I was the only Republican that didn't sign a letter recently, and the letter said that they condemned the agreement. And I said, well, if you're condemning an agreement before you see it, aren't you simply condemning diplomacy? And I think that's the problem. I mean, it may be a bad deal. They're already describing it as less for less. Well, it's probably going to be less for less because we rejected more for more. I mean, that's what the first agreement was, more for more. Was it perfect? No, I had objections to it. If I were writing it, I would have probably delayed the release of the money that they got over years to help ensure compliance. But by most public accounts, Iran was adhering to the agreement. Many of the objections were that we objected not to their straying from the agreement, we objected that it wasn't an agreement on ballistic missiles. So it was an entirely different objection, and the only way we could have ever gotten any of those agreements was, one, keep the agreement we have, add to it with a second agreement. But what I've said from the beginning of time, and I think this is true, but once again, this requires you to think or at least understand the way your adversary thinks and not go crazy thinking because you understand your adversary, you are sympathetic with your adversary. But I firmly believe Iran would never deal with their missile technology or ballistic missile technology unless their adversaries in the region were to come together. The only way you would ever see some sort of peace agreement that goes beyond sort of the nuclear agreement, which may or may not happen, the only way you'd ever see a ballistic missile agreement with Iran is if Saudi Arabia were sitting across the table and Israel, the people that live around them. See, we think it's all about us, but my guess is Iran thinks about its neighbors as well. And so I think that we don't think these things through. We just think, oh, yes, we're going to do this. There's no evidence that the sanctions on Iran did anything. We got out of the nuclear agreement. They increased their enrichment. We made the sanctions worse. They increased their enrichment. Somebody killed their scientists. We probably know who. Killed their scientists, and the enrichment got greater. So just from an objective point of view, it seems like it's getting worse. That leaving the agreement, even if it was an imperfect agreement, didn't make things any better. And yet everybody says, oh, it's going to be a terrible agreement. It's going to be less for less. Yes, it's going to be less for less because we rejected more for more. So the thing is then I say to people, well, what do? You want a military, what your military response? And then they've got to think through. Facts are important. As you enrich uranium, you start out with a big pile. As you enrich it more, the pile gets smaller. As you enrich it even more, the pile gets even smaller until you might be able to hold in your hand enough for a bomb. When the pile is that small, you can put it anywhere, and there's no way you're militarily destroying that. You also militarily cannot destroy knowledge. So we shouldn't, before we see an agreement, reject the idea of diplomacy. Will it work? Will the agreement be perfect? I don't know, but I know having no diplomacy is not a good idea. Recently, Israel's been criticized for talking to Russia. Well, when did we get to a point when we were critical of discussion, of debate, of talking? I mean, we talked to the Soviet Union for 70 years, fortunately. We had deconfliction, we had conversations. So I think it's important that we have voices in Washington who believe in some restraint. And people say, oh, it's terrible, there's no real voices in Washington for it. I would argue that there are some things that have gotten better. I think some of this started with my father. I think some of this actually was continued with Donald Trump and others. What has happened is when you hear of Ukraine and everybody's, there's a 24-hour furor on TV about the war, and some of it justified. But the thing is, when you see all of that, how many voices in Congress are calling for sending troops into Ukraine? Very few. I mean, you got the crazy Kinzinger and Liz Cheney maybe, and a few people wanting a no-fly zone who have no idea that it would mean having a direct war with Russia. But really the vast majority, even the neocons, the leaders of the neocons, we won't mention their names, Lindsey Graham, they're not really calling for putting troops into Ukraine. So I think we've had some success. One of the things I've done through the years, and it hasn't gotten a lot of attention, is every time they put forward a war resolution, and I literally mean a war resolution. It's not typically an authorization of war, but it's somehow a bellicose statement that Lindsey Graham wants to broadcast to the world of how angry he is and how tough he is. But I make them put it on every one because they can only get it through unanimous consent. Now, I could just object to it and keep it and stop it completely, but even sometimes that's difficult. But what I've chosen to do is do this. I've added a clause to every resolution that I can over the last 10 years. And it says that nothing in this resolution is to be construed as an authorization for force, for military force. I've started adding another one for the Ukrainian ones because Lindsey likes a new one of these every day. I've also added that nothing in this resolution is to be construed as an authorization for the introduction of troops. Because, they might say it's not kinetic force they're using. We're just going to put 100,000 troops in Ukraine, but it's not going to be kinetic action. So I think it's important that we put these things in, but the other side has accepted these clauses, and I put them in all the time with the hope that they actually mean something. I began doing it after the Libyan no-fly zone because we had a Thursday afternoon like we have today where many of us are traveling back to our states, and they passed a resolution after we were all gone and didn't tell us it was coming up, and it passed unanimously because none of us who would have objected were here or knew about it. But it was a resolution in support of a no-fly zone in Libya. And so then Obama held it up, even though it only passed the Senate, not the House. President Obama held it up and said, look, the Senate unanimously is for a no-fly zone in Libya. Well, it wasn't true. So we've tried very hard to make sure these sometimes meaningless sense of the Senate sort of resolutions have this clause in, and it's been of some benefit to us. With regard to sanctions, though, people say, well, is your viewpoint different now? Well, actually, it kind of is. I think sanctions can be threatened, and I'm not against using them as a threat to try to change someone's behavior. I think if you sanction something in advance or you're not clear as to what you won't get anything for it, and the sanctions will never be removed. So Nord Stream 2, I've always been a believer that maybe more interconnection between us and Russia was a good thing. This is before invasion. But the thing is I also think we have to have sovereign nations and sovereign borders, and we can't just let people willy-nilly roll tanks into another country. And so would there be an objection? Yeah, I think if Germany's possible, they shouldn't turn on Nord Stream 2 at all, and it sounds like they are. Now, they could have been a little clearer up front. If they would have said that with much more explicit language, maybe Putin might have been deterred. But that's not what happens in the Senate. In the Senate, they decided, by golly, we're going to sanction Nord Stream 2. This was before the invasion. And I said, well, what would it take to remove the sanctions? And they said, we don't want to remove the sanctions ever. I said, well, what would it take? What would Russia have to do? Oh, nothing. We don't want them to sell any natural gas to Germany. This just happened to be a senator from Texas, who I guess they have this thing, liquid natural gas they export. But I mean, here's the thing is this is someone putting sanctions on forever for a provincial reason to protect the supply of something that is sold in his state that might be exported to Europe. And so I don't think sanctions, it's sort of like saying, I'm going to kidnap someone and I want $1 million, but I think I'll kill the hostage first and then ask for $1 million. It's like once you put the sanctions on and you have no plan to remove the sanctions, how do you have demands? So I'm not saying that we really shouldn't ever use the threat of sanctions. I think the threat of sanctions could have some ability to influence behavior. But once you place them on, this is a problem. We have hundreds of sanctions against Russia, hundreds of sanctions against China, and nobody's talking about what they have to do to remove the sanctions. And so I think sanctions that are not specific to a reason or with a specific reason to undo the sanctions really probably end up having no value at all. As we look forward about where this is going to turn out, my prediction is, from the evening news, the same as yours. I hear some reports, but I'm not sure I've ever heard anything in a classified setting that was actually classified. But from watching the news, from listening to the story, I think it's been a huge disaster and a miscalculation for Putin. I think, the questions they ask, the media will come up to me and say, what will you do? What will the United States do if Putin uses chemical weapons on the Ukrainians? And I say, that's the wrong question. What will the Ukrainians do? What do you think the Ukrainians are going to do? They're bombing their civilians. Russia is bombing their civilians. They're bombing innocent people. A maternity ward is bombed. What do you think the Ukrainians are going to do? I'm guessing they're not giving up anytime soon. What if Russia takes their capital? I think they fight on. They kill one Russian at a time. I don't think this ends anytime soon. They are very, very unhappy with people invading their country and killing their civilians. What do you think happens to their degree of unhappiness if they kill 1,000 people with a chemical or a mustard bomb or some kind of primitive chemical weapon? I think they're going to be incredibly angry. So it isn't so much always about us. It's even like on transferring those MiGs. Why did we have to be part of that at all? The Polish have them. Why did they have to go to the U.S. before they'd go to if they were going to go to Ukraine? But the thing is that we always think it's always about us. Everybody always thinks it's all about us. And I think that there are many things that actually are less escalatory that actually don't involve us. But I do predict that this has been a miscalculation, that even if Putin were to take over the cities, I don't think the Ukrainians lay down their weapons. And the one thing not many people have mentioned is if you're a 19-year-old Ukrainian nationalist and now the royalties are going to a puppet dictator who's in Kiev that is a puppet dictator from Russia, you think there's any incentive not to blow up the pipeline that goes across Ukraine? How long does it take them to repair it? 10 days. How long does it take to blow it up? Another 10 minutes. So I think there would be this, and plus the country's in disarray from what's going on. I don't see any people saying, oh, well, it's not, but you do see them talking at least about neutrality. I think the stickier point is I don't think the Ukrainians will sign an agreement that agrees to give up portions of their country, but I'm not so sure they have the military might to eject the Russians either from some of those portions of the country. But I do think that the foreign policy, a constitutional foreign policy that believes that war should be the last resort, not the first resort, that the decision to go to war should be difficult, and that war should never be exercised or begun in our country from the sole decision of one person, are important precepts. I think if we stick by those, there's a lot of good things that come from that, and there's still an uphill battle because most of Congress believes the president should be able to do whatever they want. But I think there is a growing movement within the Congress that I'm part of and others are part of that truly does believe in the constitutional role of the Congress in war. I think we are having some successes in making them think twice about intervention. I'm going to continue that fight for a constitutional foreign policy, and I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.